Hi, my name is Connor. This presentation is aimed at my fellow university students to encourage them to think critically about our place as global citizens and our responsibility for addressing climate change. The rise of globalization has led to the idea that individuals belong to a global community that extends beyond national borders. This concept is known as global citizenship, and suggests that rights and responsibilities extend not only locally and nationally, but also globally. Global citizenship is important because it encourages both individuals and states to take responsibility for global issues rather than focusing solely on what impacts them directly. Climate change has been described as one of the most significant human rights challenges of the 21st century. As global citizens, it is important to acknowledge that while the impacts of climate change are global, there are they're not experienced equally. So some states are significantly more vulnerable than others. A clear example of this is Kiribati, a small island developing state with a population of approximately 114,000 people spread across 32 low-lying atolls, most of which sit around 2 meters above sea level. Due to its geography and limited resources, Kiribati is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. While the foundations of human rights are debated, they are broadly understood to be moral or legal entitlements held by all individuals by virtue of being human and are essential for protecting human dignity and basic living needs. These rights are outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, otherwise known as the UDHR, and include rights like the right to life, health, housing, and an adequate standard of living. In vulnerable states like Kiribati, the impacts of climate change are a threat to these rights. So, climate change is contributing to food insecurity in Kiribati by impacting local agricultural production. Environmental changes like rising temperatures, drought, the rising sea level, and flooding are reducing the ability to grow crops. Consequently, agricultural output in Kiribati is declining despite the population growing. So there's less local food available. This has resulted in a reliance on imported food, often of lower nutritional value. Um, this demonstrates how climate change is threatening both food availability and quality in Kiribati. Consequently, there has been a rise in non-communicable diseases in Kiribati due to poor diet. This shows that climate change is impacting people's right to an adequate standard of living and their right to health, as outlined in Article 25 of the UDHR. This demonstrates that human rights are not only dependent on legal recognition, but also on factors like food security, which climate change is actively undermining. Climate change is also contributing to water insecurity in Kiribati. Rising sea levels and flooding contaminates fresh water sources with salt water, so rainwater is their primary water source. However, rainwater is seasonal and difficult to collect as there's no runoff in the country. That means no rivers, lakes, or streams, etc. Um, and there's also an increase in drought due to climate change. Consequently, there isn't enough water to supply the population of Kiribati. This means that communities are forced to drink water intended for other uses like hygiene or agriculture, or use unsafe water sources contaminated by salt or even animal waste. These conditions in Kiribati threaten the people's right to an adequate standard of living, and their right to health, as outlined in Article 25 of the UDHR. In more severe cases, prolonged water insecurity also threatens their right to life, which is outlined in Article 3, as access to clean water is essential for survival. The rising sea levels, as a result of climate change, present a threat to Kiribati and its people due to the displacement it's going to cause. Due to Kiribati's low-level geography, there's no inland space for relocation. Sea levels are predicted to possibly rise 2 meters before the year 2100. This would leave Kiribati uninhabitable, so citizens would lose their land and have to leave their home. This will severely impact their human rights. The rising sea levels threaten their right to adequate housing under Article 25 of the UDHR, as well as their right to participate in cultural life, as outlined in Article 27. The loss of land represents a loss of identity, culture, and connection to place. Climate change in this context is not only an environmental issue, but a threat to the existence of the nation of Kiribati and its people. All of these impacts demonstrate how climate change in Kiribati is not just an environmental issue, but a direct threat to human rights. While these rights are thought to be universal, the erosion of food security, water access, and habitable land demonstrates how rights cannot be upheld without environmental stability, emphasizing the idea that climate change is fundamentally a human rights issue. The unequal impact of climate change raises questions about responsibility. While human rights are thought to be universal, the extent to which they are threatened varies significantly across the globe. This is evident in the case of Kiribati, which contributes minimally to the global greenhouse gas emissions, but faces some of the harshest consequences of climate change. This demonstrates a disparity between those contributing to climate change and those most affected by it. From a global citizen perspective, individuals and states are part of a global community where actions in one part of the world can have significant impacts elsewhere. This global interconnectedness means that responsibility can't be limited within national borders. New Zealand is a higher emitter of greenhouse gases compared to Kiribati and benefits from the systems that contribute to climate change, while not facing the same impacts as Kiribati. This highlights why responsibility should be distributed equitably based on both contribution to the problem and the capacity to respond. This places a greater responsibility on nations like New Zealand to reduce their emissions and support vulnerable nations like Kiribati. New Zealand's responsibility is further reinforced by the native Maori perspectives on land and identity. For Maori, land holds immense spiritual value and serves as a vital link to their ancestors. Their values and culture are tied directly to whenua, the land. Through this perspective, we as New Zealanders should deeply empathize with the situation in Kiribati, where climate change is threatening not only homes and infrastructure, but also human rights and the existence of the nation and its culture. Our sense of responsibility should not just be based on economics or politics, but empathy and ethics. The case of Ione Te Tauta demonstrates the limitations of the current system in addressing the impacts of climate change and the responsibility we should feel. Ione sought recognition as a climate refugee in New Zealand, arguing that the impacts of climate change in Kiribati threatened his health and safety. Despite the court's acknowledgement that there was evidence of harm, Ione's case was Ione's case ultimately failed, as the existing refugee law requires the presence of an identifiable persecutor, and climate change didn't meet the requirements. This is an example of New Zealand failing to extend protection to those affected by climate change, despite its responsibility and capacity to do so. It exposes a significant flaw in the current legal systems, as those facing serious harm from climate change remain without adequate protection, which reinforces the need for change. This highlights the need for a perspective that challenges the existing state-centered approaches and emphasizes responsibility for addressing the harm that occurs beyond national borders. Climate change in Kiribati ultimately demonstrates that while human rights are supposed to be universal, they are not equally protected. Their realization is shaped by global inequities. So those least responsible for climate change are facing the greatest threat to their rights. Addressing this issue requires an approach grounded in a global citizenship perspective, that encourages responsibility, equity, and collective action. Thank you very much for your time.